There we go. So how's your week been?
Pretty good. I got like they finally gave me the contract for the new position at work. So
And explain to me what that was again. You're a team lead now, aren't you?
to some extent, like it does involve like a managerial role because it's Scrum Master.
Right.
And then they haven't decided what the new tech for the new, because they're probably just gonna like rebuild the software as a service like just from scratch, but with like they've already gathered a lot of the product specifications they need for it.
Right.
So I'm just waiting to see what tech they decide to build it on, and then I got to go learn that really fast.
Isn't that the thing about programming, eh? Constantly learning new languages and everything else.
Yep.
That was the one thing, like when Jade left homeschooling and the guy that created Inscribed, I knew we had mutual friends. So how he hires people is through not-for-profit, nonprofit ventures. So he'll kind of set up something in medicine or charity or something, and then build something, and he'll bring new people in to work on those things for free. And then if he likes how they work, and if he can work with the other players in the team, then he pulls people out of that. So he was asking if I would participate in this thing on a news site. And I said, yeah, sure. And then he's like, this is what we're going to do. And then I immediately came back and said, well, that doesn't make sense. Why don't you do it this way, that way, this way? And he loved it. And then he pulls this team together, all really highly competent people. And they're all on languages and all on platforms I don't know. So it started off as your regular LAMP stack, and then it's going to be a WordPress backend with a custom front end and everything I know I can do, right? But then they're working off Amazon, which I've never done before, and then it's working off Node, which I've never done before. So I'm trying to ramp up on all these languages, and these guys are already well down the road. And I keep saying to them, listen, I don't have the skill base for this. So if you want me to take a more managerial role like I used to, where you don't necessarily need to know the technology, I can manage this other stuff more, whether it's project management or more formal management, or even just functional analysis and stuff. He said, no, you'll catch it. Until I finally was like, listen, I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore, because I don't want to spend like the next 3 weeks staying up, 36, 48 hours at a time to try to learn a language, because you get to points where you can't stop. It's going to take you 3-4 hours to ramp up if you stop and go have a coffee right now. It's like, don't leave it right now, right? So I was like, I'm out. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't have the metabolism for it. But
Yeah, I think most of it's all like all the languages and frameworks are mostly all the same, but because they are all like adapted a little bit to their particular use case, you do have to put in the work if you want to get up to speed on the new one.
Well, yeah, and you do. It's like, frameworks are all written in the same language, but they still all have their own syntax, right? And then they all have their own features, and then that goes back to their own design pattern philosophies. And so on the heels of that, I end up building the software for the company I'm at. It's like a quoting system. It shows Vue on the front end, and just blast it through it. It's like, I just want to get this done. It doesn't have to be, it has to work and it has to be stable, but it doesn't have to be production quality. It's only 15 users or whatever. And we've incrementally adding to it. And I never used components in Vue. I would just copy it over, create a new Vue object, and continue on, because I didn't want to take the time to figure out how to do components properly, or use, Vue, not Docker, the variable management, so the Vue objects can speak together. So I didn't bother with that. I built my own, and now I'm regretting it, because now I'm into it, and now it's pretty massive, and I'm like, fuck, I should have made that a component. I should have used the Docker there, and so I'm slowly trying to bring it up to where it should be. But so I ended up doing all the things I was trying to avoid anyways. I just don't get paid for it now.
Dang.
How's Spencer?
Hi, I'm well. I just started working with this guy who wanted to get into management. and he's a developer, and he's like late 30s, and he's kind of getting tired of learning new frameworks and learning new libraries. So he wanted to move into more of the management type position. And he expressed this to a mutual friend of ours, and I've been looking for work. So I approached him about a business he was looking to put together, and he ended up not wanting to pursue the business stuff, but he had some other clients he wanted to work with. So I've been helping him out with those projects. And so I'm kind of breaking my ground a little bit with the tools I've been working on for like 3 years now. Kind of almost at a hobby level, but now I'm finally starting to get some return on it.
Good for you. Yeah.
So
I mean, that's how I started out. I mean, it was I was driving a truck, and then thought computers were kind of cool, so I built one. I had a store that would refurbish computers and radios and stuff. So I started buying parts off them and getting advice, and built a computer. And then like a year later, I was doing HTML and CSS. I can't remember the guy's name now. David something. He was the guy that broke the web because you couldn't format anything. CSS wasn't even around. So you'd have all these hacks and tricks to get web layout to be more like print layout.
Yeah.
So it was totally into that. I was loving it, right? And then, meet people on little side projects, build a website here, build a website there. And anyway, 2 years after that, I had a fairly good portfolio of these sites and a lot of Flash sites. And then from that, I wanted to get out of the truck. Then I got hired on to do product testing for commerce and shipping on local level, and spent 2 years doing that, coming up with an analysis on what works and what doesn't. And it all started off as a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
20 years later.
Yeah. So it's good to finally get that. I've been kind of had this on my sites for quite a few years now, coming from an art background. But so it's like I said, it's good to finally get get some experience and building up a little bit of rapport and some network connections, and so.
Excellent. Yeah. Good I thought that you were doing this professionally for a while.
Well, like contract, but it's kind of like on and off. I've been slipping out and doing some part-time work as well. Doing like delivery, warehouse type work, customer service, just all sorts of little things. But I also have been doing contract programming on the side as well. But it's starting to ramp up more, which, I've just kind of been pressing that more recently. So
that's excellent. That's fantastic. And how's Michelle?
Hi, Michelle's good. How are you guys?
Good.
Good weekend, good week so far?
Yeah. Been programming this week. It took me 3 days to get productive, but now I'm pushing along. And then the 2 weeks of holidays didn't help. I did literally nothing all through the entire holidays. The first 2 days I slept. I don't think I had a conversation with my wife until a week after I was on holidays. And then, so I had to sit down and start programming. This is just too much like holidays. It took me forever to get my head back into it and get disciplined again. But
was she happy about not talking to you? Are you a very chatty person?
No, she was very good about it. She's very accommodating. Because I'm still new to the trades. Like I have my own trades, but because it's renovation, I'm always bouncing between trades and then working with guys that have the experience. I didn't realize how much that was mentally draining. Like, you're doing something professionally that you're not quite sure about. You kind of have to pay that little extra attention. So when holidays hit, and then it was like the following Monday, and not really having a full weekend off for months. And it was the following Monday, and I woke up and just realized I have been sleeping on the couch for 2 days. And it was just like mental exhaustion, right? just wrapped up a big project, and I'm exhausted because I've been doing things I don't know how to do for 2 months. Yeah.
So you got some rest. That's good. Sometimes it's just necessary.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The kids are all good.
Good stuff. No more sick kids.
Good.
How's the hubby?
Everything is good. I can't complain. He's out with the kids, so I've got some quiet time while I, do housework and stuff. The usual. Everything's good.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks.
So any topic we want to talk about today? Nothing in particular. I'm going to have Heaven's Wolves has been posting stuff about long and short wavelengths and correlation to sort of that. How would you say it? The analogy of, I guess it would be electromagnetic energy to other things, maybe complex systems or whatever. So I'm going to chat with him tomorrow night, and I'll post it up because he couldn't be here today. And then, I don't know, the only other thing I could think of, I've been arguing with people about Iran all week. That was aggravating. And then that one article that had some great terms, and that was the Evonomics one that I thought was great in touching on pretty much almost all of the concept stack leading to natural law. So there's that. We can chat about that. I like the term vehicular viability. I think that is the term that I know I've been looking for a couple of years in describing things like the libertarian fallacy or why the left consumes societies and stuff. It's exactly that. It's vehicular non-viability. And I can't think of anything else that we want to chat about. Any questions?
I'm late, so I didn't actually get any chance to. How about the immigration program, the rural immigration program?
Well, I mean, it's to be expected, right? I think that there's a convergence of common interests around immigration from needing to maintain a tax base. And I think the one thing that people don't realize is that when governments go into debt, they still have to be somewhat aware of their credit rating. And that credit rating, like any credit rating, is going to be measured partly by income, future income. If you have a declining tax base, you have a problem getting debt, right? So there's the interests around maintaining a tax base. There's the interest about maintaining a labor force. There's also a big interest around maintaining a consumer demographic, because that's the Xers and the millennials are the smaller demographics. Now we need a consumer demographic that we don't have. And then there's the left wing weaponization of demographics to bring voters in. So all of that's converging, and it would make perfect sense that if demographics as a weapon, political weapon, is at play, then what they're going to do is they're going to stick immigrants right in the middle of their conservative base, which is rural and small community places, right? And I think there's also there's some pushback, or I know there's a fair amount of pushback in Toronto around immigrants because we don't have the facilities for them now. So it's not something that's being published a lot, but Tory's been pushing back at the feds for quite a while, saying we simply can't take any more. We don't have any facilities for them. We have homeless people dying in the street because the homeless facilities are taken over by newly arrived immigrants. So yeah, I mean, the writing's on the wall.
Yeah, we need more people trying to drive on the 401.
Exactly, eh? And the thing I find about Toronto, because I have to commute through like 3 or 4 distinct areas, because I'm in Midtown Toronto, and then I'm usually out to Scarborough or the beaches or somewhere in there. And so Midtown Toronto is still like downtown. It's full of douchebags. Everybody's aggressive. Everybody's trying to get advantage. It's a pain in the ass. But they drive quickly. So if a light turns green, everybody like floors it and takes off. And then I get into sort of East York, and they're a little bit more cautious. It's like they're not in so much of a hurry. And then you get into Scarborough and everybody just creeps. It's like a light turns green and it's backed up for 3 blocks. And only 5 cars get through the light. And I just find it's like I'm confronted with differences in demographics on my commute every day. It's making me a racist. So it's
well, I mean, we know people like cluster by like ethnicity and then to some extent by, you know, thought pattern. So
yeah, and it's, you know, I joke about ethnicity. It's more like bigotry, but then it makes perfect sense. Like Scarborough, you have these long 2-lane roads that only have lights at every city block. So when you're from Midtown, it's like, oh man, I can zip across the city in 15 minutes. But then you get these drivers that they're probably used to having more cops around and speed traps and stuff that are just kind of coasting along, and they all drive side by side at 30 kilometers an hour. And I also think that I'm going against the commute. So the commuters that are driving fast are already downtown. And I'm in with people that are dropping off their kids at school or going shopping or something. Yeah. So anyways, it's interesting to see minor social frictions as they change from neighborhood to neighborhood within the same metropolis.
yeah, I'm trying to read some of this stuff. This is a bit of like a segue, but like I'm looking at some of the stuff I was tagged in. So it's like Heaven's Wolves was talking about a lot of people having the amygdala screwed up, so they're not detecting threat properly. Is that getting into what you were talking about, like the physics model that he has for it?
Yeah, and because he had some posts a couple of weeks ago where he was talking about long wavelengths. What was it? Long low energy wavelengths versus short high energy wavelengths. But then I can't remember it exactly. We'll get into it tomorrow, but he was like, I think it was frequency he was using. So he was drawing parallels to, say, like military organization, where you have a lot of low trained, say infantrymen, which would be high frequency, low intensity, or high frequency, high energy. And then you have this low frequency, long wavelengths, which would be sort of your snipers. And then you have your Pareto distribution of that throughout military organization. And then he drew that over to urban heat island effect. I think I have that backwards. Island heat, I can't remember. Essentially that with global warming, when they're looking at climate studies, cities generate heat. So you get an island effect of heat when you're looking at the weather or looking at climate, and that's always clustered around urban centers. But then you have an analogy of urban heat island to like social enemy. So your crime is higher or mental illness is higher. Well, that's similar to an island heat effect. And I think that he is drawing connections between that the effects of a city, the intensity of a city is having these maladaptive effects. And then he took it one more step, and I can't remember what that is right now. So I think part of what he's saying, I think the large part of it is analogy, but I think there might be something underneath there that he's getting at, like urban populations with sort of the constant stimulus has an effect on the amygdala, which then does two things, like it's not only affect friend or foe, which was a response to something that I wrote. It also has to do with emotive versus, or essentially it's empathy. So empathy versus non-empathetic behaviors also tie into the amygdala. So when I was doing the meditation lectures, I looked at the amygdala, and certain meditations prune gray matter out of the amygdala. So it's predominantly white matter. And those meditations tend to make people more cold-hearted, less empathetic. And then there are ones that actually increase gray matter around the amygdala. I'm actually thinking it might be white matter now, which tend to be more empathetic, but they're actually less aware and less responsive and less like the idea of a Zen master being very calm in the face of stress. That would be the pruning meditations. The other meditations make people more flighty and more emotional, but also more empathetic. Well, we got the same dynamic there. And then that ties back into what I was saying about truth theories, that there are three main points on the spectrum, from correspondence through cohesion into profundity, into emotion. That too much white matter on the amygdala would be that emotive side, where it is emotionally leaning, it is more empathetic, where correspondence would be more about the pruned amygdala. And there's an optimum somewhere in there that seems to be the best.
If we're understanding it right, and it looks like we're both reading it the same way, it's like he's talking about like radiation, temperature, pollution, social density. So you have the overstimulation, so that overloads all sorts of things, including the amygdala, which screws up the threat detection. So that's why you would have, like, let's give an examples here, like siding with like the Bloods and Crips over the police, or like you hate the US but you're wearing a communist flag.
Right, yeah, exactly. And because I had posted that thing when I was going on about the right's virtue signaling on Iran, I had sent a message to Kurt saying that it seems like the left presumes everybody's friendly, the right presumes everybody's a foe, and that or the far right assumes everybody's a foe. So that's why there's constant division on the right, is this misapplied foe detection, and then on the left it's misapplied friend detection. And then the conversation that I had with him in the background is that that correlates to female response to oxy and male response to testosterone. That the more oxy with females, the more out-group adversity they have. And then with testosterone with men, the more in-group preference they have. So I was talking to him about this would make sense as a species, because if you have a group, women need to be more aware of distant threat because they need time to gather the children or run to safety. So their threat detection is further out. It's at a distance. So it's an immediate aversion to an outgroup. So just a side note, that would mean that racist bigotry is actually pushed through the line through the mother. So, and that guys have a similar dynamic, but it's driven by testosterone. And then that makes sense, because the males would have to go out and approach the threat and decide if it's friend or foe. So there isn't an immediate outgroup aversion. And even with males, the outgroup aversion is always fairly flat, and the in-group preference is actually fairly flat. But when they're confronted with a foe, when there is dominant signaling or threat signaling, they actually have an increase in in-group preference. So the fight or the adversity is actually driven by protecting the others in the group, not by killing the enemy. And then this coincides with military culture, with the notion of band of brothers and so on. Yeah, and that now we're right back into endocrinology and in hormones and things. So Evans Wolves is looking. He hit the amygdala thing, which I didn't even think about looking at it, because I've been looking at testosterone, cort, adrenaline, noradrenal, and can't remember the other one. The one that has the same effect on women as testosterone, not peptides, or something like that. So he's hitting on I think a new layer of granularity by looking at this heat island effect on top of it.
Because yeah, that's one of the things that jumped out at me. That sounds a lot like high C. It's like when you reach the carrying capacity, everyone's chronically stressed, and then now that screws up the threat detection.
Right, and what are some of the traits with high C? But increased in-group competition. So in-group members are competitors for resources, and more amiability to trade with an outgroup. So impersonal trade is specifically it. Trading without there being any sort of kin sentiment or a bonding involved in the person you're trading with. So it goes right back again. That is, density of population is a factor. I think it's also exposure to the environment, rural settings. There's a higher transaction cost for consumption of the commons. That means things like your roads aren't going to get plowed before you get up in the morning. You have to deal with your immediate environment more and be more adaptive to it, which we would say you have to take on more personal responsibility if you're going to live in the outskirts of the city, where lower transaction costs for consumption of commons in the city is much lower, so there's less value on it. So now we're talking about demonstrated interests in property, so it's not seen as so much of a property. You couple that with a less outgroup adversity, and everybody's a friend, so let's just share all of this wealth with everybody else. It goes. So it's I think it's speciation.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is obviously there's all the environmental factors, but blank slate is obviously nonsense as well. So it's you get, if you're going to take all these immigrants, put them in the rural settings, it's to what extent are they going to continue to vote left, right?
But that's a good point, right? Because in Canada, the Conservatives are playing the same game, and they've done that with Sikhs and I think East Indians in Calgary. So Jason Kenney, most of his following is an immigrant base, and it's because they're socially conservative. So he really pushed the conservative side with those groups to gain votes from them, because they're socially conservative as well. They're highly religious, right? So it's interesting. A lot of these immigrants are not going to be coming from overpopulated areas. They're going to be coming from the countryside. So how is that going to play out in the rural areas?
On the flip side, I think it's only urban white women that actually vote left for their own people, right? It's if you vote left for someone else's people and then they give you their stuff, that's, you might be right among your own people still, right?
Yeah, that's true. Pat Ryan and his blaming white middle class women, his new trope. Yeah. But it's easy to kind of get locked in these kind of contingent phenomena like politics or even culture when it is downstream from biology. I think part of the reason why we're seeing the divide in rural to urban centers is because people do self-sort. So the kids out of that family that have high C traits, they're going to gravitate towards the city and eventually be there, and then mate with other high C people. The problem then is in bringing people to capital. So now you're pulling people out of where they would naturally sort themselves, like a rural or small community, that now have to be in the city to make a living, which is where I factor in. Right? You're in there because that's where the work is. So that's an issue.
I have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First question. This is more curiosity than anything. Do you guys feel or have a sense of hesitation discussing the differences between male and female when there is a female participating in the group conversation?
I'll answer first, and then I'll throw it over to Elaine. I have apprehensions with it all the time. Because it's too easy to collapse the aggregate conclusions against the particular. So it's very hard to say something on the aggregate, like a feminized brain, without that being easily applied to, say, my wife, right? Or that woman I work at the office that I hate. So I don't like, and then also, yes, it is a feminized brain. And yes, it skews with gender, but that's also the extreme outliers. So the extreme outliers on that side of brain development are female, and then the autism spectrum, it's male. But the vast majority are still a mix of it. So I prefer to identify it by the the behavior rather than the gender categorization. Because the gender categorization isn't going to be as accurate as describing it by behavior, right? By doing it by gender, you're less apt to pick up on male presence within that group. Where if it's defined by what the defining qualities are, which is the behavior or the biases involved, then you're able to capture those finer nuances. So you can now come down the ladder towards the particular from the aggregate, right? Which is what operationalism is about identifying if there's a break between domains, the small scale, human scale, large scale, and is there an operational connection between them, right? And I say the same thing around the Jewish question. I say the same thing around elites and everything else. We need to define these things by the strategies that they're following rather than the particular groups that have resulted from those strategies, because the groups are contingent and they're apt to change over time as the strategies change over time. So they become less accurate. How about you, Alan?
So, yeah, for me, with talking about like gender differences or anything else that could be controversial, I don't know if I would say, I don't know if apprehension is the right word, but I do try to be calculated. Like it's sort of like Andy's thing with frames. If I'm actually going to bother to try to communicate with someone, I'm not going to, I can assume there's certain trigger points there when you're talking to people until you have enough of a rapport with them where you can where you see either, yes, that is going to be a trigger point and there's going to be nothing fruitful from like going down that line of rhetoric with them, versus yes, they're okay with it. Or sometimes as you build up like more of the context and they see where you're coming from and you see where they're coming from, then it can go from being a trigger point to no longer being a trigger point.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I know when I first started talking about these differences with my wife, I would get the neck salt arguments and I would get a lot of whataboutism right off the bat, where now she's not. But part of it is that I don't use that frame to start off with. I'll talk about autism versus psychosis. And then if it becomes relevant, then I'll say, and this skews across gender. One's an over-feminized brain and the other is an over-masculinized brain.
It's and as long as you have like that background information, it's like the thing about like a knack salt isn't that it's untrue, it's that of course it's obviously true. It's like that you wouldn't even need to say it.
yeah, and that it doesn't dismiss the aggregate.
Yeah,
right. That's why I like that most aren't quite like that. With the definition across the aggregate has a similar phenomena, which I think is what these people are getting at, is that the tails do define the stereotype. The stereotypes are most accurate across groups, and that most people within the bell curve aren't quite like the outliers. They're not quite like the tails. So most aren't quite like that. But this is also a spectrum of measure.
Right? Yeah, the average is like a mathematical abstract concept. It doesn't necessarily exist in an individual.
Right. Yeah, and then the law of large numbers as well is at play. So I think that there's some qualities that are stereotypical across a group that you'll find within an individual. But I also think that there are qualities, group qualities, aggregate qualities that are a result of the law of large numbers. So the law of large numbers is that irrelevant factors become relevant across large groups of numbers, across large iterations or large calculations. So one example of that is actually intrinsic bias. So if you look at ethnocentricity by groups, whether it's whites or Hispanics or blacks, there's demonstrations of some degree of in-group preference. And it hovers for everybody somewhere around the 12 to 15 mark. So blacks are a little higher, Hispanics a little higher, whites are a little lower, but it's all somewhere around that range, 10 to 15% or 10 to 20%. And then you say, well, why is that? And you say, well, most of it comes down to things like social friction. So it's not actually bigotry, and it's not actually prejudgment, and it's not some systemic training that we all gain intuitively. it's social frictions. So if you have two employees and one has a really thick accent and the other doesn't, and they're both pretty much on par, and you need to get something done right now and it's really critical, you'll tend to take the person that doesn't have the accent because you don't want to deal with the added friction of a communication issue. And then that shows up as an in-group bias.
Right.
Right. So that happens enough on an individual level that when you skew it up to the group, it ends up being about somewhere between 10 to 20% of all decisions end up being an in-group bias. Well, that in-group bias, if you're talking about every decision an individual makes, probably doesn't even show up 0.1% of a time. But across the group, it's about 20% of the time. So that's the law of large numbers. It's only significant at a large scale. And it loses relevance as you move down into the more particular.
Interesting. Yeah.
How about Spencer?
Let's see. Yeah, you touched on a little bit of what my approach has been. I'm just getting started with argument in general. I haven't really been very much of a verbal person for most of my life. I've mostly focused on music. But yeah, the thing I've noticed is, approaching, I mean, I've gotten a pretty good intuition for which points will raise some hairs. So I can tangentially talk about other points, related to human biodiversity, talking about IQ or testosterone or neoteny. And, I don't have to bring in like the really, really common stereotypes that people get triggered by. But you can still like educate them in some regard, and then maybe maybe they'll be interested enough to reevaluate their biases. I don't know. That's what I found so far.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you can't get rid of the stereotypes, but if you understand them, they become less stereotypical in our application, right? Because that's essentially that's all a stereotype is a heuristic. It's a fast thinking, intuitive response to an immediate situation where you don't have time to consider it. That's the role of it. But that doesn't mean that you can leave it without the sort of longer thinking discursive side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I was looking at some of I think the Brandon's thread with the stereotype stuff came up, and I was looking at some of the empirical arguments for stereotypes and just going through some of the epistemology there. But yeah, anyways, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of people go into it with this idea that stereotypes are always inaccurate, but anyways.
Yeah, and I think that the criticism really is that applying a stereotype on an individual level is going to produce more false positives than, well, it's going to produce more errors than not. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's been the argument against bigotry from the beginning. Right? Is that you're going to be wrong about it, and then by doing that, you're creating frictions that are unnecessary.
Yeah, generating more resentment.
Yeah.
Although from Eli's, I forget what it was called, but he wrote a piece about that, and he has a point though. It's true, if you just take a stereotype and apply it, there's a high probability that it's false. But if there's an average behavior that occurs with people in your group, it's like you can't tell. You're going to incite conflict by telling someone else that you have to take on the cost of separating out which of this it applies to. So it's like if you want someone to voluntarily sort that out, you would have to find some way to demonstrate the value of doing that or signal something that separates yourself from it clearly. So
this would be the idea that if you're part of a community that has a lot of detrimental stereotypes, then it's up, and you don't belong to it, you have some responsibility to correct that within your community, or you just have to accept the stereotype. I think, was that what he was getting at, if I remember the post correctly?
I think that's maybe like a corollary of what he was getting at. I think like it's just a clear analysis. It's, if you want someone to put in the work to figure out if you're an exception to this, the two things I think he said you could do is you reduce the cost of figuring out that you're an exception, or you increase the potential value. You signal, hey, I'm really valuable. You might want to figure this out.
Right. Yeah. So in other words, if I don't want you to categorize me by that stereotype, then I need to give you a reason for it. It's either by benefit or by signaling, counter signaling the stereotype.
Otherwise by coercion, and then you're inciting a conflict.
Right. Right. Which makes sense.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, that's actually interesting, because this is part of what was going on with the threat I had on Iran and far right virtue signaling. It was a matter of detail. What detail are you going to do your analysis? See, I mean, you can measure things by one dimension or two dimensions, and you're not going to be able to capture all the information. That at some point you need to get into an operational analysis that can accommodate more information if you're going to have an accurate view on it. So you need to analyze instead of moralize. And that virtue signaling is really demonstrating that that you're pasting over missing information in the one or two dimensional analysis with moralizing, that you're backfilling for an epistemic failure. And then oddly enough, the long conversations, the 3-day conversation I had was essentially that. I'm saying you have an oversimplified view of the world, and then they would continue with straw manning, but they would throw detail after detail after detail to straw man my position. And every step of the way, I'm like, there is a counterfactual to that. So analyze, don't moralize. Analyze, don't moralize. It was good because I think I have a greater intuition around moralized arguments that were more subtle than I did before, even in my own arguments. So it ended up being beneficial in the end. But again, it's that aggregate versus particular analysis of data, right? Have to have them both.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like, obviously no one's infallible, so just because you're like a general doesn't mean you're always right. But if you take someone that's like a studied, practiced professional that's doing an operational analysis on like a military decision, and you're like, well, I have this heuristic I want to use, it's like
yeah, you're bad, you're an enemy for thinking that. And it's like, no, wait a minute. I'm not saying I'm thinking that. I'm saying that that's what the facts are. So now let's go back to our preferences and see what we can do about those facts, right? The analysis has to be amoral. It has to be valueless or moral valueless on a moral scale if you're going to understand the operations. Or else all you're going to do is pick out data that fits the preference. You're never going to get an operational understanding. And I think that was the point that I was trying to make to them, is that, or eventually, because the conversation got so diverted, you almost have to look at group survival strategies and that humans follow incentives if you're actually going to do something about the problems. You can't use like a Hegelian dialectic or an A to B to C sort of easy formula that you can paste over anything and output a conclusion. You actually have to look at how things are fitting together. And I get a big pushback from it.
I mean, if these are like people that are in the like proprietarian sheepdog space, I would expect they're probably thinking that they did do like a strategical operational analysis, and this is like the option that's going to produce agency. So they probably think they're being amoral about it, but it's the whole like it's Zionism, it must be bad. Like we're like Israel owns US, so you know anything that Israel wants must be bad. And it's like that makes you as much like if you just do the opposite of what someone does just to do the opposite, you're as much a slave as if you just do what they told you to do. It's like you just have to think for yourself on each point, right?
Right. And it was oddly the proprietarian, and they're pretty there. I don't think there was any SN in there. The proprietarians that I was actually coming after specifically was a couple of proprietarians. They almost immediately were like, "Oh, okay, I understand what you're saying, Bill. Yeah, right." Because they were talking about killing white conservatives or preferring to kill white conservatives and all this other stuff. And I'm like, "Well, look at what you're doing." And I think it's people that were more tangential that aren't. I don't think they're necessarily P advocates, but maybe were interesting that just jumped on, and it was like. It was like, well, I don't know if you guys remember the movie Corporation that came out of Canada. It's that sort of an anti-capitalist thing. And then the same thing with those videos about 9/11 and war as a rich man's
Loose
racket
change
or something. Yeah, loose change and all those. When everybody came out and then everybody had this new way of measuring geopolitics. And the underlying narrative behind all of it is United States is evil, United States is evil, United States is evil, or military is evil, military is evil. It was almost like we were back in that day again, where it's just like these are the arguments. It's just that when that happened, I was the one on their side at the time, you know, and just say, well, no, look, I've been there, but there's still more to look at. And that's the incentives. These are responses to incentives. You have to understand the incentives. Once you start to understand the incentives, the group strategy starts to fill out, and now you have something to work with. You know?
Or even if you're going to boil it down to like a heuristic, how about they're saying death to America?
Yeah, and then if you're going to want to espouse the virtues of these people, it's 5 days later, and now they're saying death to dictators. You know, so there isn't a whole lot of stability around what's going on in that region, you know, because now they're saying, because the plane was shot down, they're saying death to dictators, and they want to kill their own government now. So it's like this seems to be a mode of operation that isn't, you know, got a lot of foundation behind it. Just kill everyone.
Yeah,
which is what they were saying about the Americans, right? The Americans are you are just saying gas everybody, and it's like, wait a minute, we're not the ones saying that, they are, and that's why we throw our military in there. So, last week kill Americans, this week kill dictators.
That's face before truth, I guess.
Yeah.
Did you guys get? Alain, you're in Canada too, right?
Yeah, I'm in like the outskirts of Toronto. I'm in Pickering right now.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought you were further out west for some reason. Did you guys get that warning signal on the cell phones today?
Yeah. I didn't see it till I woke up.
Yeah. So what? I don't understand. Do you think they were just doing some testing rounds, or? I just found it odd that they're like, oh, nothing happened, and then, oh, really, nothing happened.
Yeah, they said it was a training error. So I imagine I grew up in a town that was full of nuclear reactors, small town too. So we would have these drills all the time. So I imagine they run these drills all the time, and somebody hit the button that they weren't supposed to, and we all got the notification.
Wow. Mm.
So I'm just glad that I sleep like a log, and I'm glad that my wife ignores her phone when it goes off, or we probably all would have been running for the hills or making phone calls. I mean,
I put my cell phone on airplane mode because I can't be losing my sleep every time some kid in Canada goes missing. I'm thinking of getting a landline just because I feel bad if someone actually needs to get a hold of me at night, you know?
Yeah.
So to have like an emergency line, but the phone is airplane mode, man, because they're too cheap how they implemented it. Like apparently they just took the American system and just copied it, but they did a partial implementation, so everything comes through at the presidential level instead of having it tiered.
Oh.
So they're saying you don't care about children, but they're virtue signaling to protect a private corporation that took government money and was too cheap to do the product properly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because Greg Renouf made a good point, was that if you're sending me an Amber Alert when I'm asleep, I'm not going to be the guy that catches that father who's kidnapped his son, right? So don't wake me up in the middle of the night. Wait until I pick up my phone and then give me the notification. But I was thinking about this morning, is that what if it really was, a meltdown at a nuclear plant? You would need to be woken up for that. And I wasn't. I didn't see it until I woke up in the morning. My phone was there all night. So imperfect plans.
Yeah, I didn't know. I just thought it was another Amber Alert, so I heard it, but I didn't bother getting up because I didn't know that we would be notified for something like that, right? So
yeah, and the talk about unintended consequences. They throw enough Amber Alerts at us that we don't even read them anymore. It's like, oh, there's another Amber Alert, and I'll look at that later or check the news when I get home.
yeah,
right?
pretty much.
Not only that, it's like it's an Amber Alert and it's doing like a nuclear holocaust noise.
True. Yeah. In the town I was in, we had a pole in the center of town. It was a long, narrow town between two highways, and all the refineries and factories were on one side of the town. So they stuck up a pole. It was probably 200 feet tall with air raid sirens on the top in case there was a problem with the reactors, or if there was an attack from Russia, because we were the only, I think we were one of two target sites, Russian target sites in all of Western Canada. And there was a day, I think I was probably in grade 4 or 5, where they would test the horn, but they would let everybody know 3 or 4 days before that it went off without any warning. And yeah, it was mayhem for the better part of like 2 hours. I remember walking home because we were being sent home from school because of this alert, going, I might not make it home. I might get toasted in a missile fire, a missile launch before I get home. Why are they sending me home? I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I'm standing on a bridge over a highway in the middle of the prairies. I'm going to get baked by fire from something that hit 1,000 kilometers away. Why are you sending me home? Aren't I supposed to be under a desk somewhere? No, I don't think it was until the local news that they told us that it was just an error with the system.
So maybe next meeting we can talk about strategies about stuff like that and what you would do and I don't know where you would go or what you would take or stuff like that, but off the record.
Yeah, I'm ill prepared. I actually don't think it's a good idea, because one of the things about a prep plan is to not share it. So I think maybe conceptually we can talk about it.
Right.
Yeah, but I know a lot of guys aren't willing to talk about it because it reveals to their neighbors what they're up to, right? Or what their philosophy is on it. I'm just terribly ill prepared. That's it. I'm prepared for sort of a natural disaster, but not a real boogaloo or anything. Glenn is a Superman, so he's got everything sorted.
I assume it'll just be like the whiskey warrior thing, like, right? Someone will just jump on Instagram and they'll be like, all right, guys, it's going on now.
Yeah.
Here's the place and time.
Here's the address. Get there as soon as you can. A meetup. Yeah, that would actually be one thing that we could set up, is meetup locations if anything did happen. Right? Like a lot of families do. Like if you're spread out in the city and something goes wrong, we'll meet at this location. Get there as however you can, right? And that's something that sheepdogs can do. You can, pick different towns in the middle of nowhere throughout North America and say, if anything happens, try to make your way here, and then we can maybe help each other out.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. I didn't, the habitus gentleman that I had a scheduled call with today, I called him and he messaged me back saying that something came up and he had sent me an email, but he didn't send me an email, so I checked the junk mail and we didn't get a chance to talk today, but it's just something that just keeps coming up, that type of shelter that you can keep mobile with if need be, right? So
Yeah, I've seen a few that are pretty interesting. I just couldn't see from that particular site how it was done. I mean, so that's all I sort of wanted to see. Now that Andy's here, I'm actually having to leave in like 5 minutes. So maybe
I thought you might be. Are you able to like leave it running and then come back?
Yeah, well, definitely. Or I'll kick it over to Alan, and he can continue recording and hosting, and then I can catch up on the videos after.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't join earlier. I was on another thing. What have you guys been talking about in very short form? What
have we talked about? We've talked about some stuff that are going on in the community. Some posts that went up at SN. We talked a little bit about local issues here around Toronto. So I don't think there's anything in particular. Was there anything other high level that we talked about? I guess we were talking about the effects of one of the posts that came up was the idea of like heat island effect or over urbanization, and how that affects the amygdala, and then subsequently how that affects friend foe detection, that sort of thing.
I look at these things quite a lot about in terms of balance. It's quite an odd paradigm to use, but let's say take each person as an individual and say, let's just take me, because I can talk about myself because I know myself a bit better, and I say, am I prone to anxiousness? And I'm not. But I'm very low. I've smoked quite a lot of marijuana in my life because it makes you paranoid, for example. It makes you anxious, but it calms down certain minds. And for someone who's way below average in anxiousness, it's actually kind of that balance. I'm not saying I need more anxiousness. I'm saying that sharpness of almost paranoia is it's sharpening. And I think it's sort of like being very, very indoorsy, being an introvert and being an indoorsy. Actually, you go out into the fresh air and you spend some time. It might be challenging to your comfort, but you're expanding yourself. So if you're talking about the amygdala through over-organization, I think it's like the meditation thing, where the people who need the meditation the most, whether you're pro or anti, it's another matter, but the people who benefit from meditation the most are actually, again, sort of autistic people who are much less likely to believe there's any benefit. So those artsy kind of, go free love, I'll go and meditate. From my experience, they get very little out of it other than thinking they're feeling good. Whereas someone whose mind is like mine, who just never stops going, meditation is unbelievably useful.
Yeah, and this is actually something that we had brought up, that there's obviously different types of meditation. And there's been studies on how different types of meditation have different effects on the amygdala. So a lot of the more visualization heavy meditations, more like sort of the Tibetan or New Age stuff, increases, I think it's white matter. I can't remember if it's white matter or
Vipassana. Have you heard? Yeah, and then it is white matter. Yeah, so the white matter is the connect. Well, it effectively helps the connection between the corpus callosum. It's why women have that sort of, they connect things. You're having an argument with a lady in the nicest possible way, and she'll bring a topic from some completely, thing, and it just annoys the. I used to watch my mum do it to my dad, and then I've watched every girlfriend do it to me, and I think it's not just that they're stupid or I'm stupid or I'm missing. It's just the female way of kind of it just. And I said, hold on a minute, we're talking about this right now, and you've just brought that. And the funny thing is, if I do it to them, it's as if it's kind of normal for dinner. And I think I'm going to, as a joke, bring up a topic from a year ago and see if she notices. So I bring it up and she doesn't notice. She just continues as if it's completely normal. And I'm thinking, but like our brains are so, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And then things like Vipassana or Zen meditation or Komjin, it does the opposite. It prunes it. So there's more emotional control.
I really like Vipassana because it's sort of get those, it's the breathing, it's the flow, and then it's the softly push them away. And for me, there are two forms. I suppose they're both meditation. One where I put my hands in a shape over my stomach and I lie on my back and I breathe in a certain way and I think about a topic. So I'll think about testimonialism. I'll think about a certain project I'm doing, and I'll build shapes in my head and I'll think about them. And I do all sorts of things. But then the other one, which I find actually more useful, which is the more pure Vipassana, which is actually you breathe and you empty thoughts. It's usually something like car sounds you focus in, or breathing. And then as the thoughts enter, you think, I'm just gonna, I could probably have some of this food tonight. I could, oh, I need to, and you go, nope. And you just, but it's actually a training. It's kind of like tying your shoelaces, you know, so I had an operation when I was 21. I slipped a disc and I was in hospital for a while, and I had to relearn how to walk. And it's a really strange thing because it had only been a few weeks, and to realize how dependent we are on practice in everything we do. And I mean everything we do. It's so weird. It's like when we were talking about in another Sheepdog about people who live on their own and going a bit mad. I think quite a lot of that is, it's a similar thing, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Vipassana is one of the few that I would recommend. But I think it's more than just silencing thoughts. The other side of Vipassana is when tensions rise and relaxing into them. And then allowing thoughts to flow is where the main benefit is. In all of those practices, whether it was Zen or Vipassana or Kongjin, I was taught that these are preparations to actually do meditation.
Okay.
And if those are the ones that are sort of pruning white matter around the amygdala, the meditations that come after that are the visualization ones, are the ones that regrow those connections. So that's an interesting dynamic that, you know, you're getting the fat away and then you're rebuilding these connections out of the other meditations.
That thing about the Carl Jung that I might have mentioned before, that, you know, it will be in the filth, it will be found, that Latin phrase that Jordan Peterson said, what you most need will be found where you least want to look. Mm-hmm. I think that phrase is so deep because it feeds into this whole balance thing I was saying of what you as Bill think that you want is kind of encapsulated. It's trapped in some sense by what you think you want. I know I'm not trying to be tricky. I'm saying that in order to get things done in the world that you want, and in order to become wiser by your own standards, current and future, you benefit more from, in some sense, doing the opposite to what you think you'll do. So you gravitate towards the things. It's almost like you have to split it. You say, okay, I have this plan within my life. I have these things I'm very interested in, like reading this particular book or doing this sport or going about it in this way. And then you say, actually, where are the areas in my life where I'm really imbalanced? And I don't know if there's an answer, if there's a structural answer for this, but I think each person needs to answer it separately. And I'm trying to do it with other people and with myself, and then back to other people and then back to myself, constantly thinking. And you meet someone and you think, oh, this person's smart, or this person, but there's something that's not quite there. Mm-hmm. Often you can attribute it to an imbalance, like they're on some sort of drug or they haven't slept. A lot of people I've been speaking to, I think, God, the last 4 times I've spoken to him or her, they've been fascinating. And this time they're there going, and you're thinking, oh God, and you talk to them, they say, no, I haven't slept. And you think, okay, well, that completely makes sense. So I do relate it a lot to this balance. And I think when I talk to groups or Sheepdog, a lot of the things I come back with are balance comments. So if everyone's going, oh, way, hypergamy is bad, or oh, way, this is, and everyone's reading, I think, okay, what is this group joy around particular no-nos doing? That's, we're talking about that secondary cause, that second order cybernetics, the second container. Anyway, there's some thoughts I've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And even even the question, like asking yourself where that balance is, I don't think that's something that you can contemplate your way out of it. So one of the things that I had learned in meditation is that whether it's physical or mental tensions, both of which are intentional, and that intention isn't happening at the level that we're consciously aware of. We can be. So even body posture or body language is a set of there's a set of tensions or it's tension that if you're relaxing out of, you can see that it is something that you're doing. And if you're doing it in response or for a reason, that if you're relaxing into it and able to keep your mind calm, it might be a memory or a new train of thoughts will come up that will be attached to that particular tension that you're releasing or relaxing.
Well, there's another thing.
And then that goes back to, if I'm wanting something and the things that I think I want are quite often just these closed loops that are maintaining sort of unintentional tension. It's the things that you want that is actually sincere. They tend to just happen without you having to think about it too much. But those, I really want this. I really want a new Tacoma. There's something wrapped up in there that is more about maintaining a way of being in the world, rather than actually acting in the world. So a side note.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I'm just wrestling with the one question in life. I know it's a bit deep to go into, but it really is this question of, when do I trust my intuitions? I'm not talking deep science. I'm just saying, I like to think that the more experienced I am, if, I talk about poker, I have an intuition, you're bluffing, I'm probably going to be more right than you are or someone else, because I've got that experience. Maybe I'm not. Maybe in the individual case, I'm wrong. But when I'm talking about something like woodwork, or something I know a medium bit about, or then something I know very little about, is it literally, should the model in my head be, the less experience I have, the less I trust my intuitions, the more experience I have, the more I trust my intuitions, or is there a better model? And this is, I don't know whether it's something you've thought about, but it's really getting to me. We like to say, yeah, we sit on science and you use data, but in the end, in the moment, you can't just go, well, there's this, you're in the moment, you're facing something and you're considering it in a certain way. Let's say you've got 10 seconds to think about it, or 4 minutes, and you're on your way to a meeting and there's something very important that's come up. You can't over intellectualize it. You need to use your intuition at some point. And my question is, how do you shape how and when you do and don't trust your intuitions?
For myself, I find that the one intuitions are really an adopted heuristic over time. So it's backfilling for not having the time for a long discursive analysis, and that experience may not necessarily correct that. The experience you have could actually just been nothing but reinforcing that heuristic. So I don't know if experience necessarily leads to a better intuition. The indicator that I use is how much change in my way of being around that topic that I have experience around. How much has it changed and refined? And then that would be saying that that's an intuition that I can maybe trust. And then the other thing, this goes back to what I learned from meditation too, is if the intuition has a subtle or nuanced tension behind it, is most likely motivated and not accurate. And an intuition that actually reduces tension, so the tension is given way for attention, for sensory, then it is probably one that I can trust. So it's actually a very physical thing.
I find that, the definite yeses are more pronounced than the definite no's for me, which might be the opposite for you. So let's say I get something and everything feels like it's just shifted into gear, and you read a piece and you mull it over, and then these questions, everything's just sort of shifted like that, and questions have been answered, and you feel more integrated, might be the only word, or whatever it is. And often my intuition there is that I need to keep thinking about this, or I need to start acting in a way in accordance with the lesson from what I've just read. Mm-hmm. And the evidence suggests anecdotally that this is a much more easy side than when you've got something where you go, no, my intuition is I must stay away from that. I must, I don't even know how to describe it, but I've just started thinking that we talk about these conscious decisions we're making, and they're the end product and the process of all our thoughts. But really, in the moment, we're not as logical as we think we are. And I'm trying to build a better model for this intuition.
Right. I think that if an intuition is correct, the effort, the motivation, or motivated thinking, or it's almost like a higher metabolism. The excitation drops. It's a calming.
Yeah, I like that.
Because there's less effort now to maintain the model for the information you're dealing with. So
Bill, I need to pause you, because
sure.
I've noticed something you're good at, and this isn't a praise. Sometimes when I say something that sounds like I'm praising it, I have no intention to praise it. It doesn't interest me. I'm just trying to observe something I think you're doing, and it's beneficial, which is sometimes I watched Sheepdog 10, I think it was, and I made loads of quotes. And I think I sent you a few, I put a few out there, but what I've realized is you're quite good at in the flow coming up with sentences. I've just forgotten the one you did about 30 seconds ago, but you just come out with a phrase and it perfectly. I just mean it observationally. Just keep doing it, because we're all good at different things, and I don't know. I get value out of it. I rewatch this and I think, and you just go and then you just go boom, and that sentence is so quotable. And anyway, I really enjoy it. So you're a lot better at it than I am.
I wasn't aware that I was doing it, so I don't know if I could keep doing it. Yeah, no, I think that There's a lot of value to meditation. There definitely is. None of it is mystical, and I would say that nearly none of it is psychological either. It's visceral, it's somatic, it's physical, and you gain a lot of personal insight into how mind works, but also how my mind works. And so the idea of this dance between tension and not, that if you're bumping up against something and you're fighting vehemently for it, the effort that you're putting in is an effort to maintain a structure to hold the information. And if you gain an insight and then it's like, oh, that's what it is. Well, you're releasing the tension. That tension is actually the effort put in to maintain the frame.
Yeah.
Where now you encounter a new frame that might be larger, it can accommodate more information. It takes less effort to maintain, less intentionality to maintain. So the filter, the interpretive filters we have demand effort. So if you're moving into a better interpretive frame, it takes less effort. It's able to accommodate more information rather than.
Yeah, that's what I say about IQ quite a lot. You know, IQ, people with higher IQ find a lot of things easier. And it's because they take less effort to do the same. If you say, you know, 7 times 7 is 49 and you test 100 people, some people struggle over that. Other people, you know, if you go 7 times 7 times 7 and then, or, you know, or whatever you do, the harder people find it, you know, it's exactly the same kind of thing. And I think that's why I've always looked at this idea of, in economics, a division of labor and specialization. Mm-hmm. And it's like, are you going to be what's it called? The jack of all trades, master of none? Or, you know, is specialization for insects? You've got loads and loads of phrases you can fire out. Basically, one side saying specialize, specialize, specialize. And the other side saying enjoy life, be open-minded, try everything. It doesn't matter about. And I think there's an interesting tension between those two to look at yourself and think, where do I specialize? How thin do I want to spread myself? Because that's a really, really interesting question. I felt that since about Christmas, I've spread myself way too thin. So I'm doing this. I'm organizing this conference. I'm flying over here. I've had someone to stay with me for a week. And I'm just thinking, like, I need to just, in the nicest possible way, like push some things away and shut them out. And I think it's a constant struggle through this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 20% of our metabolism goes to the mind. On that, I'm going to move hosting over to Alan, and then he can kick up. I got to put my glasses on for this. And
all right, brilliant. We'll see you next week, bud.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for popping in. I'm sorry I have to leave. I have to do laundry, is what it is. My daughter's laundry.
It's got to be done. It's got to be done.
Yeah, it's. I couldn't do it this afternoon. So, okay. So Alan has hosting, and I am going to stop my recording.